My name is Libbie Weimer. A little bit about the law center where I work is that we serve 6 states in the American South, and I have the pleasure of working at the service of groups of attorneys and communications of people who are trying to protect the right to clean air and clean water in our region. And for today's talk, I'm not going to show you any code. I'm probably not even going to show you any of the tool, because what I really want to talk about is the process of making tools, who they're for, and actually how to make them usable. I know that everybody in this room has seen a variety of tools, and I would argue that you've seen a variety of tools that you might think have a purpose, and some that just seem to be an exercise in creating something for the purpose of creation, which I think is totally fine. But in the work that I do, because we do have a vision for change in the world, it's really important for us to think about how something is connected to that pathway towards something different happening in the future. So on that, I'm going to talk to you about PFAS, and I'm going to talk to you about uncertainty, and I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of structure that, as I have the enormous privilege of actually remaking a tool, that I hope will help me make a better tool, and I hope y'all can make better tools with some of these ideas. So I'm going to talk about PFAS, which is a class of chemicals. You might have heard of it as emerging contaminants or forever chemicals or GenX. It's a class of chemicals that's really common in everyday household products and industrial processes. It's things that are non-stick or stain resistant. It's found in Teflon and waterproof things, and it's also useful for electroplating and creating semiconductors. And in the past, and continuing to today, it is dumped freely into our communities and into our water. And it hasn't necessarily been tracked or necessarily been understood fully, even though the exposure of these chemicals to people, even at pretty small concentrations, can cause health impacts. So this system, about 3 years ago, I was brought to my attention, and the attorneys asked me, after we've settled a case in North Carolina where there was pollution of GenX in the community water for Wilmington and surrounding counties, which you might have heard of, where else is PFAS, and what can we do about it? So because I'm naive, I was like, okay, I will map that. And what you have in this very, very sophisticated emoji diagram is a little bit of what that system looks like. So there are obviously industries that are using the chemicals. Some of that chemical is going to go into air, and sometimes there is a direct outfall. By the way, whoever here maybe is making emojis, maybe meta people, I need a pipe emoji. But anyway, so that chemical, though, is often not actually piped or outfall on the site. It's usually transferred to a wastewater treatment facility that's actually going to process the waste from these industries, and then they have a location of an outfall. Well, actually, it's even more complicated than that, because with wastewater treatment facilities, there's going to be the liquid effluent, and there's also going to be solids from that facility. The PFAS themselves tend to accumulate in the solids from our wastewater treatment plants, and those are applied as amendments to the soil in land application sites. So actually runoff from agricultural sites is one of the main areas where we have pollution entering our water systems. Now, to the other side of our diagram is where people come in, where we come in, which is obviously very important to this issue. So we have drinking water systems in the South. A lot of those are relying on surface water that have an intake at a location. They're going to be serving a community, which is you and me, but they're also going to be selling that water to other communities who don't have access to water from a drinking water source. So when I say, sure, I'll map that, I had an idea of what I would do. And what I found out was that almost every part of this map is somewhat or completely unmappable. So as far as the polluters themselves are not disclosing that they're using the chemicals. So I do not actually know which facilities are and which facilities are not using these chemicals to try to trace this pathway. I just have an idea of a general classes of kinds of industries that may or may not be using these chemicals based on what they do. Now, the wastewater treatment plants, I know where they are, but the information of how they actually, which significant industrial users are connected to which wastewater treatment plant is decentralized. It's not collected in some database of all-knowing state entity, federal entity. And the wastewater treatment plants themselves may or may not be really interested in sharing that information because the industrial users are their clients. They are being paid to treat their wastewater. So they have kind of a complicated relationship with those entities. Now, land application, except in some cases in our region, we don't know where these sludge fields are, so that adds another layer of uncertainty in our geospatial map that we're in our conceptual model. When we go to our drinking water systems, we're actually very fortunate that we have a map of the location of intakes, but as far as the communities, we have very coarse information. We have maybe a name of city or maybe a set of counties. When you're working in rural areas, it's really important to know actually who's connected to a pipe system and who isn't, because there's different vectors, ways that people are at risk, whether it's actually through a direct connection to an intake or maybe through risk of their private water well. And that's a really different way you would approach that problem. And then there's the connection to different water treatment or municipal water systems, which also is something that's decentralized. I found out recently, though, that it sounds like USGS in their mapping of water is going to be publishing information about the connections between different water systems, which is enormously exciting for me because I've been tracking down this information for a long time, including bluffing that I was going to go to a municipal building in Birmingham to photocopy some handwritten documents. But then, miraculously, they photocopied them for me. So, what do I do with all of this? There's an enormous amount of uncertainty here, but we have a problem that merits attention and merits the attention of our attorneys on staff. So, my first instinct was to just throw everything I had at every part of the system, which I think is like a very understandable thing to do from an analyst point of view. You want to gather and hoard information. But the problem is that you're going to get burned out. You're actually not focusing your attention, and we have limited resources, and what's at stake is actually people's health and their lives, so you have to think a little bit more strategically than I did at the beginning of how to map these things, what's important, and then what I'll talk about as well is like how you can apply cartographic principles to then make your tool usable and more actionable. So I was thinking about this as I was recreating my tool, and I kind of created what felt like a rubric that was important for me. You might have different axis on the vertical axis, but I think everybody should have this horizontal axis, which might be what's more important, but I would sub in the word actionable, like what's actually actionable about your tool when people are using it. And for me, I have this huge problem of certainty. Certainty is both for geolocational information and also just what's actually relevant. I could map every facility in every county of our region, but only some of those facilities are actually using these chemicals. And to get to this kind of perspective of what's important and what's actionable, you can't just be zipper mouth sitting at your desk. You actually have to go out and talk to people who might be using this tool who know more than you. And I had the fortunate experience of having 3 years to work with the attorneys that are doing this work to actually learn what is important information, what is actionable information. So as I revisit this tool, I can think about where do some of the elements of that graph, that system go on this rubric. There's some new symbols, some new emojis in here. We have monitoring and testing results. This is something that is geolocationally specific. We have good information about it, and it's actionable because we actually know PFAS was found at this location, at this concentration. We also have information about the water intakes that I told you about. Now, what's less certain, but certainly actionable, is the facilities, because ultimately it is the industries that are culpable in this case and need to be held to account. I have an airplane and a fire truck on the less important but very mappable and very certain, which is that another way that PFAS pollution enters our ecosystem is through airports and military sites because of firefighting foam. They do exercises with the foam to be ready in case of a fire, and then all the foam just gets kind of washed off into storm water drains, and that foam is full of PFAS. So very mappable, but not as actionable in this case. The wastewater treatment plants are kind of in the middle. I won't get into that too much, but essentially the wastewater treatment plants are actionable in the sense that they are a connector to the industries, but ultimately we want them to stand with us and hold hands and say, actually, do you know what is in the effluent that is coming to your site? Not, you're the bad guy, it's your effluent, because that's ultimately not true and not really helpful. And then the communities here. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that the communities are not important, but because of all the enormous uncertainties about who's actually being impacted by this, to kind of put a big red polygon around a community and say your water is being poisoned is not responsible. So in the sense of creating a mapping tool and the audience of the mapping tool, I want to focus on what's actually actionable, what's responsible, and what we have enough certainty to actually say in a responsible manner. So I'm always going to be talking about the communities, and people are going to be front and center in this work, but they might not be front and center in my mapping tool for that reason, or there's other ways that we're going to talk about community that isn't necessarily putting a point on a map to represent them. So on the top, there's easily mappable stuff, right? And something that I want to point out in a pitfall that I've fallen into, I've seen in other maps, is I think we get kind of confused as cartographers about what is easily mappable and what's important and what needs to be highlighted. There's all kinds of stuff, like I could put the airports in there and give you tons of information about airports, but it's not actually that actionable, so I need to kind of pull it back and restrain myself in the creation of that tool and not just kind of you get the tool everybody's seen, it's like the kitchen sink approach of the tool. There's so much stuff in there that it's not actually useful or actionable. And on the other side, there's the actionable stuff, and like I was saying, there's one corner where mappable and actionable actually overlap, but there's the stuff that I talked about that you might have to rein in a little bit. And then there's the stuff that's less certain, that is outside of our comfort zone, that we then maybe, I'm trying to rephrase as my favorite part to create a tool around, because that's where we can be creative, that's where we can create custom or bespoke items, and that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity, because it's not the stuff that's immediately obvious, it's something that you as an analyst in creating a tool can unlock some kind of potential there. So another way to think about it, again, going back to emojis, I love emojis for their resonance with our emotions to understand a concept. So if you have really good data, like I say, go for it, flex, create some cool data viz. If you don't have really good data or it's really uncertain, that's, like I said, be creative, use your brain. The stuff that I think is kind of our cartographer danger zone in the diminish region is that stuff that's easily mappable and it's right there, and maybe you can make a really cool visualization of it, but it's not actionable. So diminish. And then, one of those things in creative pursuits, like in the introduction, I worked in documentary film, it's always about how much can you remove, but still have a narrative and still have something useful. So here's some other words that I kind of put in there. In filmmaking, it's kill your darlings, right? That's what you cut. And also, I think this then connects also to our cartographic principles, because we can use color and icon, we can use scale to highlight the importance of what's actionable, to create that easy connection to somebody who's using the tool. And we can use those same kind of cartographic principles to, maybe there's information that we want to have in the tool, but we don't want it front and center. So for me, when I'm making my map, and I'm sorry, this is version 2, the first version. The second version is yet to be birthed into existence, but I have help and ideas, and it's on its way. But so, when we're thinking about go for it, and the things that we're really going to highlight, I wanted to go straight to what kind of monitoring has happened and make that's visible at every scale. That's the first thing that you see when you enter the map. And there's actually been 3 years now of monitoring that's happened in our region that is going to be the huge focus of my recreation of this map. I started with this map where actually, because the monitoring had only happened at drinking water systems, where the monitoring and the systems themselves were one layer. But they're actually going to be teased apart in the new map, because the intakes and the information about the intakes is so important to the lawyer, so actionable. And then the monitoring will be its separate tool, and because so many different kinds of sites have been monitored, whether it's just like surface water or a wastewater treatment plant, a water treatment plant, even soil, I'm going to design a whole new set of icons for that. And I wish I had had Figma set when I did my first set of icons because it was really annoying. And when we're thinking about the things that we maybe need to restrain, I have these little symbols for wastewater treatment plants. They're only visible when zoomed in. They're simple. I only label them. And then, for the facilities, I'm actually going to not use any color at all the next time I introduce them in the map, because the location of the facilities is not important. What's important is that I've created a tool where you can look up by the expiration date of that permit, and then you will see a list of facilities, and then I want to make sure that list can be exported, or you can look up a facility by a permit number, because that's actionable information by our attorneys who are tracking these permits and submitting comments about the permits. And when they submit those comments, they can say, we've had testing in this county that has this levels of PFAS, and this is the water intake for this county, and it serves this many people. So that is what I wanted to say. Some of my favorite emojis are there. I made this tool in ArcGIS Online, and I think that you can make really useful tools in simple interfaces, so I encourage you to use the tools that you have, which is partially why I used emojis to create my presentation. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Libbie. That was a great talk. Have we got any questions from the audience?
Thank you, that was great. In terms of action, this is more of a PFAS question than it is a GIS or mapping question. Are there, I wrote down my questions so I don't forget it. In terms of actionable items, are there parameters of permissible levels in waterways or sample sites that are held to be at the state or federal level?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't get to in the redesigning of the tool is originally I had text. I created narrative text and pop-ups to describe what testing had happened. And I did that on purpose because ultimately our attorneys are writing letters, and I wanted them to have text that they could put into those letters. Because the EPA has published health advisory levels for 4 different types of PFAS, when I redesigned the tool, in that pop-up, I'm going to do a treatment for each of those type of PFAS at what level it has been detected compared to that health advisory level. If other PFAS have been detected, again, using kind of cartographic principles in a smaller text, I will report those, but they won't be highlighted within the pop-up. So we're trying to just get people to the information they need as quickly as possible.
So, in your example, the work you are doing, the polluters are mostly the point locations, whereas the effect is more aerial. How did you map it? I mean, did you do any kind of point pattern analysis, or is it because with respect to concentration of this in the water, I think when you add more water, the concentration would be less as you sample down from the location. So right at the location of polluters, it may be high, or how did you consider these things while you were mapping this project?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Because the pathway of pollution to the water system is convoluted and complex, and there is so much uncertainty about where actually higher concentrations might be. Is it going to be at the effluent of the plant, of the water treatment facility, of the sludge field? I did make the decision to try to de-emphasize those as points of interest, and then instead make what is interesting and highlight it as where there's actually been testing and where there actually are intakes where there might be a threat. So you can get a general sense. There's a lot of this industry maybe in this county or concentrated in this town. But really the purpose is for me to give a list of facilities to be tracked by the attorneys. Then they can go facility by facility when they are up for renewal. And then they can write a letter about that facility to then say, are you tracking how much PFAS is coming out of this facility? What are you going to do about this permit? Is this permit actually following the requirements under the Clean Water Act?
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Libbie.